Hello, everybody. Welcome to the STOA. Thank you, Peter, for giving us a platform to do this. Jason and Ashley, myself and Ashley, a little bit nervous, myself and Ashley, we will be having a conversation with Chris Smaje, who is the author of Small Farm Future, a book that I loved. It was probably my favorite book of last year. And I just found it really well thought out, really kind of well researched, clearly from somebody who's been thinking about these things and practicing these things for a very long time, and is willing also to engage with the critiques of this kind of vision. I guess without further ado, I want to bring in Chris. Maybe we can just start, Chris, if you want to briefly introduce yourself, your background in sociology, your background as a farmer, everything else you're doing. And then if you want to maybe give a brief intro to the book, and in particular, maybe we can start with, you list 10 challenges that humanity faces. This is from energy to climate change, to population, to political economy, culture, water, many other things, and how you see localizing agriculture as helping to address many of these issues. So please take it away.
Sure, thanks. And thanks very much for inviting me on. My original background, as Jason said, was in anthropology and sociology or social policy, I don't know, social science in general. I guess in anthropology, I kind of dabbled in sort of peasant studies. Marxist peasant studies was sort of my into all this, and I was sort of quite interested in small-scale farmers and how they interacted with the wider world. But at that particular point in my life, I knew absolutely nothing about farming and had no particular interest in it. I had this very kind of intellectual interest in, world systems and capitalism and so on. Then I sort of drifted off from that, did a bunch of other things, got interested, I suppose, in the 1990s when the whole climate change thing started kicking off. And I think, like many of us here, started thinking about the global food being a sort of key aspect of the global systems that we're part of, and this kind of key point of connection between human systems and earth systems. So kind of got this crazy idea that I should give up academia and become a farmer, which is kind of what I did with my wife. Bought a small plot of land here in Somerset, sort of west of England, about 100 miles to the west of London. And we've sort of developed that as best we can as a kind of mixed small scale plot over the last 20 odd years. And, there's a whole story I could tell there, I guess, but, probably like all of these things, probably very similar to a lot of people's stories, but also, every farm, every person is unique, so we can talk about that. But, I suppose I came into it with, I guess, a bit of a naive view about, how everyone would love me for my locally grown onions and things. And then sort of that brought me into quite a tangible encounter with the kind of capitalist world system that, didn't love my onions quite as much as I would have liked to have done. So that sort of drew me into, back into some of that academic background, sort of peasant studies, world systems, capitalism, and so on. So I started writing a blog to sort of, express my my frustrations with the life of a veg grower, and that ultimately led to the book of Small Farm Future, which was published by Chelsea Green last year, which is very much not a kind of, it's not a how-to or it's not a narrative book. It's very much sort of trying to put small-scale farming sort of into this bigger context. So yeah, as you said, Jason, the book is in 4 parts. So basically, why we're in the shit, if I can use that word, is part 1. Part 2 is kind of looking at the ecological structure of farming and small farming in particular, and suggesting why it might help us get out of the morass. Although, you know, one of my themes in the book is that there are no magic bullet solutions. You know, we live in a world of trade-offs. You know, whatever we do, we face complexities and uncertainties and unintended consequences. Then part 3, you know, what would a society, you know, if we move towards a society of, you know, small farm societies, what are the sorts of issues that we would have to confront? And that's kind of difficult because I didn't really want to write utopian blueprints or be too predictive about exactly what might happen. But, you know, what are some of the big issues that we'd have to reckon with? And then finally, part 4, sort of how do we, you know, what are the politics of this likely to be? You know, how can we move from this very unpromising present situation in global politics to, you know, a more congenial small farm future? So yeah, you mentioned the first part of the book, 10 crises. I mean, basically, you know, there's any number of ways you can slice the cake, but you know, I looked at obviously some of the big issues like climate change, energy futures, population, because people always say, oh, you know, it's just a matter of human overpopulation, soil, water. But I guess the kind of drift of that part of the book is that, you know, there are all these proximal crises that we face that tend to be biophysical crises, you know, climate being perhaps the most obvious one. But underlying that at a deeper level, you know, it's a kind of human, you know, there's a kind of underlying human causation, which is economic, but also ultimately political, cultural, ultimately spiritual. So I sort of try and move from, you know, from the sort of superficial level, and of course everyone has, you know, their ideas as to, you know, how we can solve the problems at this proximal level, you know, nuclear power, PV panels, geoengineering, whatever it is. I mean, we've all had these sort of debates with the eco-modernists, but ultimately it's a spiritual issue, and I think, or a cultural issue, and I think ultimately the, you know, eco-modernism is a spiritual and cultural position and not actually a very technical position. Yeah, so that is sort of roughly what I try and do in that part of the book. How does small-scale farming address it? Well, with difficulty, but I mean, I've listened to you know, your earlier sessions in this series, and all of those sorts of issues about scale, localism, you know, that's the way it addresses it. I mean, I suppose the two things I would say is, firstly, we've sort of got into this globalized economic moment where we're very unconnected with the consequences of our actions, and you know, we have the sort of, yeah, you know, essentially the things that we use to live, you know, we don't know where they come from, who's produced them, and what impact that production has on the wider world, and obviously there's a kind of social equity issues as well about who's, you know, essentially we're imposing quite a cost both on the natural world and on people who are probably producing things for us in ways that we don't really know about, don't see, and aren't really aware of the, you know, the negative consequences. So one aspect of localism and small-scale farming for me is actually taking more responsibility for producing for our needs, and that immediately draws you into questions about, you know, how much to produce, how much is enough, limits essentially. And the second aspect of it I see as kind of ecological and social feedback. You know, if you're participating in that cycle, you see the consequences of your actions, and you're in a better position, shall we say, to do something about the negative consequences and accentuate the positive ones. So, you know, it's not to say that small-scale farming kind of has all the answers, but you know, that I think is the sort of, in a nutshell, why I see it as the way forward.
I'm going to jump in here if that's okay, Jason. I'm wondering if you could lay out the landscape, Chris, from your perspective as to what is going on in the world of environmental solutions. For example, I'm in the thick of environmental academics, sociologists, etc., and they are hysterical about the state of the environment. And then the solutions they propose are things like retrofitting buildings or installing bike lanes. And I think people just get so timid, or they really can't imagine the historical moment we're in and the shifts that will change everybody's livelihood. And I think, like, even trying to get somebody who knows and is hysterically upset about the environmental state of the world and the social state of the world to wrap their head around, you know, maybe more people will have to live rural and grow some food. Like, they couldn't even imagine it. So I'm wondering, like, your state of, you know, this little corner of environmental solutions, what your take on these, you know, people whose eyes kind of glaze over at the prospect of having to grow their own veg, and you know, and what's the way to reach out to them and to convince them, or to make a good argument?
Right. Oh, good questions. The last one is quite hard for me to answer because I've never been very good at kind of softening my message. You know, I basically just sort of, you know, I think and I think kind of we have to do that in a way. We have to call it as we see it. That's what I like about your sort of doomer optimism thing. You know, there's this kind of whole notion that people can't cope with, you know, the reality or the truth, and I think we need to transcend that. But yeah, it is a strange thing. I mean, obviously bike lanes and retrofitting buildings are good things to do, you know. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways in which people can sort of get involved and try and make the world a better place. But yeah, I agree with you. There's a kind of a sort of lack of engagement with the level of transformation. I mean, there's that famous Frederick Jameson quote, isn't there, about it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, you know, and we're sort of quite we're quite bought into this business as usual model. And I mean, one aspect of that, I think, is I mean, we've already touched on it. Maybe we can talk about it in more detail. There's this whole kind of weird ideology of modernity, which is something to do with progress and technology. You know, that we can't go back. You know, and there's this whole kind of metaphorization of time and progress and being, you know, improving on the past, and it has to be technological and it has to be urban and it has to be mass. So I think that's one part of it, you know, and I mean, I've certainly spent a lot of my time, and possibly in the book, you know, I think in retrospect, I think I might possibly spent too much time trying to distance myself from any sort of notion of rural romanticism, rural idyls, and so on. And yet, you know, people.
And Chris, I would just add right there, I want you to keep going, but recently I had a conversation with somebody and I mentioned traditional building, and they immediately said, like, we're not going back to mud huts. Like, people's brains immediately go to the earliest civilization when you mention anything pre, you know, progress. So sorry, I just wanted to add that.
Sure. Without, I think, often realizing that some of those, you know, traditional technologies were just supremely good technologies that were so well, you know, themselves were a result of long-term technological development and thinking. You know, so that, you know, that is a problem. But yeah, there's a particular problem. Well, you know, it's a funny one. There's a problem with farming. You know, I think just about every other economic sector, you kind of say, you know, we're gonna create more jobs in this, and people are like, great. Whereas if you talk about farming, you know, more creating jobs in farming, it's like, oh, you know, we can't possibly, you know, like nobody wants to work in farming. And I was doing a webinar the other day with Helena Norberg-Hodge, and she kind of corrected me. I was using this phrase, labour intensive. You know, I think we have to embrace labour-intensive farming, and, you know, people like Tim Jackson, his book Prosperity Without Growth, you know, he says we need to put our efforts into low carbon, labour intensive sectors, of which, you know, farming to me is absolutely the most critical one. But Helena sort of guided me away from the language of labour intensive towards job rich was her phrase, which I thought was great. So I'm going to use that from now on. You know, if you say this is job rich, you know, it's great. But yeah, you know, I think there is, you know, there are histories, you know, we in most places of rural hierarchy and rural suffering, and I think that's kind of what it it's kind of the social side of it. You know, here in the UK, you know, there's, you know, still the aristocracy owns about 40% of the land, and I think there's kind of a strong memory of you know, the powerlessness of being a low status rural worker, and that, you know, people move to the cities, you know, get more money, organized politically. You know, there's a strong tradition here in the UK of kind of radical municipalism geared around access to land and, you know, allotments and so on. I mean, there is, you know, there are radical rural traditions, but it's that much more buried. So I think, you know, we need to, that's something that we, you know, we need to recover. And it is place specific. Obviously in Latin America, for example, you know, much stronger histories of kind of leftist peasant activism, where, you know, the idea of being a, you know, campesino is you know, I mean, I don't know, but my sense is that it's a less problematic term in parts of Latin America than calling somebody a peasant, you know, here in England. But, you know, that is a huge, it's a huge political battle that we've got to fight. And, you know, I don't know what the best way of doing is. I try and, you know, I sort of talk fairly unapologetically about peasants, but maybe that's the wrong strategy. I don't know.
That's so if you were to construct the best kind of critique of your argument, or maybe you've already heard it and you've answered it, but maybe there's an argument that you're like, somebody should ask me, you know, should come up with this argument, you know, like this would be the strongest steel man against, you know, a critique of a small farm future. What do you think that would be, and how would you answer it?
Yeah, interesting. I'm just trying to think of the critiques I've had so far, which have been quite, apart from one, have been quite muted, really. But I mean, I think the strongest argument really is that it's, you know, we need to transition, you know, we need to keep global temperature, you know, below 1.52 degrees, otherwise all bets are off. I mean, you know, you can turn that critique around in relation to Ashley's point about, you know, bike lanes and so on. It's kind of like, you know, deck chairs on the Titanic, and we're not looking at, you know, people assume so widely that the kind of political structures we currently have are still going to be around in, you know, 50, 100 plus years, when, you know, if we start getting into kind of 3-4 degrees of warming, quite apart from all the other crises, you know, we're moving into a very different world. But yeah, you know, the critique is, you know, it's easier to have rapid urbanization in a kind of global capitalist system than it is to have rapid ruralization. You know, that all of this stuff, you know, it's kind of too little too late. I mean, the way I try and deal with that in my book, which maybe isn't entirely convincing, is to sort of make a virtue out of necessity, and talk about how, you know, in chaotic situations where, you know, the flow of goods and resources that people are accustomed to receiving through larger, you know, world system routes are no longer available, it kind of concentrates the mind, you know, in terms of people starting to figure out local systems. And it also, you know, I think we're going to be looking at big population movements, you know, huge migrations, a huge churn of people. Again, it's not hard to predict the problems that might result in, but also we're kind of all in the same boat. You know, it's not like there's, well, you know, still there's more people in the world who are farmers than any other single job, but essentially we're most people are a pretty long way from any sort of notion of local rural sustainability. So, you know, we have to kind of, you know, we have to work this out anew, obviously drawing on past knowledges and skills, but, you know, we have to sort of create this anew where we are, not on the basis of kind of pre-existing, you know, here first minorities or identities or so on. So sorry, I've probably drifted off a bit there, but I think, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the main objection is that this isn't going to work, but I think that objection you can level to, yeah, you know, to virtually any suggestion. You know, the Gail Bradbrook, the Extinction Rebellion activist here in the UK, you know, she has quite a nice little soundbite, which is that this is no time to be realistic, and I kind of agree with that.
I have a quick follow-up question. It's kind of like a two-parter. The first part is the objection I hear over and over again is, what about cities? You know, you can't dismantle cities. What about all the people in the cities? I'd like to hear you talk through a little bit, like maybe what the process of re-ruralization might look like. But the second part of that question is maybe if there's some historical precedents that influence your thinking about what might happen, that would be helpful, because I'm thinking of Margaret Atwood's novels, and she said, I've never written anything into one of my novels that didn't actually happen in the real world. So it's like informed by the real world, our imaginary about how things could play out. And I just want to highlight, because I said we would talk about this, you tweeted, quote, I'd suggest that the Dark Ages are often when ruling elites stop ruling and forget how to keep writing about their own brilliance for posterity. Then ordinary people come out to play for a bit, Dark Age for some, but not for others. This totally blew my mind, because, you know, the Dark Ages, how horrible it must have been for everybody then. I wonder if there are historical precedents we can look to that can help us to understand like what life might have been like, or what we should be aiming for, with a little bit more nuance than we have now.
Right. That's quite a lot of different things I'll try and keep in my mind. Yeah, I think what about cities is a really big issue. I mean, I suppose one point I'd make about it is that, you know, people tend to go to, you know, there's a way that people have of talking about cities as if they, you know, somebody kind of builds a city and everyone's like, great city, that's a great idea, I'll go and live there. You know, that's not how it happens. You know, if you look at the kind of histories of dispossession from the land and sort of capital accumulation and so on. So, you know, essentially people go, you know, people seek the easiest or the best option. So the last couple of 100 years, for a lot of people globally, the easiest or best way to lead a decent life has been to go to where work is, where prosperity is, and that tends to be cities. I think it will be the same process in reverse. You know, cities are tremendously energy and water intensive places that it seems to me are unlikely to be sustainable in the long term. So all of the, you know, all of that, those same sorts of pressures will come to bear. I mean, I do think it's kind of easier to concentrate people in some ways when you know, when you have energy available than to deconcentrate people when it all starts falling apart. But nevertheless, you know, there's still, you know, there's a degree of sort of relationality of kind of settlement scale that sort of exists. So, you know, mega cities, I think, are problematic, but you know, there are sort of potential. There's potential within cities for people to be producing food, and there's you know, there's all sorts. You know, there's the kind of garden city movement. There's the whole kind of nested central place kind of hierarchy of you know, hamlet to village to market town, so on. I mean, the town Frome where I live is sort of gentrified in recent years, but you can still see, you know, so many of the buildings in the town, you see the old agricultural use with sort of trapdoors and all the rest of it. So, I mean, I think, you know, that's going to be the, what we're going to have to reconfigure is that kind of nested rural space. And also, you know, a lot of people, you know, so many people living in slums. There was a moment about 10 years ago when slums were cool. You know, Stuart Brand was writing about this sort of stuff, cities of peasants and so on. But, you know, there's a lot of churn, you know, in poorer countries, so-called developing countries. There's, you know, there's quite a lot of churn between people living in cities, but actually having some footing in the countryside. You know, it's a kind of complex livelihood strategy. So, you know, it's not as if, you know, those sorts of linkages don't exist. But yeah, I'm not pretending that it's going to be anything other than a, you know, a sort of difficult, chaotic process. In terms of precedents, I mean, the doomer answer to that is basically there are none. I mean, you know, seriously, there is, you know, with the sort of level of population that we have now, the degree of dependence on fossil energy, the degree of urbanization. You know, there are no precedents, I don't think, to the speed, and it's the speed. I mean, I'm not at all doomy about the idea of a ruralized, you know, peasant future. You know, all of the doom is kind of loads onto the speed with which this transformation is going to have to happen. And again, I suppose going with the city point, you know, I occasionally get accused of being some kind of Khmer Rouge sort of, you know, force everyone out of the city at gunpoint sort of thing. I mean, I talk about that a little bit in the book. I mean, I think, you know, voluntary simplicity now is better than involuntary simplicity later, because, you know, you can be sure that, you know, there will be, you know, violent movements will arise with all sorts of, you know, there's all sorts of negative consequences of not embracing this sort of early, when we still have the choice. But yeah, it's better to seek a rural utopia now than a rural dystopia, you know, being foisted upon us in the future. But yeah, I'm not talking about people having to de-urbanize at gunpoint. I think, you know, the incentives, you know, are going to be there one way or another, and we just need to, you know, try and make them as positive as possible. But, you know, so at one level, there are no precedents, but at another level, there's endless precedents. You know, again, there's a whole history of you know, a pre-modern history as well, of people being incorporated into larger systems, and then you know, the ebbing and flowing of polities and larger systems. And I've just kind of switched into something I wrote about years ago and kind of forgot about, the whole kind of tradition of writing about galactic polities that was originally the anthropologist Stanley Tambaya wrote about it. And I'm trying to write something about that now, because I think it's really important, actually. David Graeber and Marshall Salins also wrote about it. So perhaps we could talk about that if there's time, but if not, the article will come out at some point, I hope.
I have two comments, and then I'll let Jason ask the next question, if that's okay. Right. One comment is, I think a lot of people have a hard time keeping straight what we're advocating for versus us trying to enforce it top down. And I'm reminded of Jason's comment the other day. Somebody was going back and forth with him. He said, "I'm not Pol Pot, bro." And I just was laughing about that all day, because like, you know, we're just describing the material world as it is and will likely to be, with, you know, with the assumption that cheap energy is getting less abundant, and, you know, and it's not like I want all of this to happen. It would be great if it didn't. We weren't in this historical moment, but we are. So, you know, that's one comment.
Sorry, go on.
Sorry. And then the other comment is, I just am reminded of a couple of paintings I saw with the Roman Forum, having cows grazing on it, and, you know, the depopulated, and it just made me think, you know, there are historical precedents of times where, you know, a crazy amount of centralization and civilization in cities, and then, you know, disbursement. I think it's just a matter of scale is the difference now, obviously. But anyways, I'll let Jason go now.
Could I just come back to that quickly before Jason? I mean,
yeah, of course.
Sort of on that point, you know, one of my favorite photos along similar lines is the Reichstag in Berlin in just after World War II. And the Reichstag has been bombed and is ruined. And in front of it, there are people growing vegetables and little allotments and wheelbarrows. And it's almost like, you know, when this great imperial dream of domination and ultimate centralization crumbles, you know, what's left? People grow, you know, people gardening, essentially. And that was kind of my answer to your question about the precedents. I think people have just been fantastically inventive and smart historically at figuring out practical local systems of producing for themselves within a wider community. And you know, the moment we sort of abstract it, and, you know, it's a classic sort of modernist thing, is that you have, you know, some sort of great scheme about the market, or the, you know, the dictatorship of the proletariat or whatever, which never really works. But people actually self-organizing locally, working with other people to deal with the practical problems that are thrown up by creating a local livelihood, you know, there are endless historical precedents, and they're always, you know, you can't generalize about them because they're specifically grounded in the particularities of place and history and culture. But, you know, the optimist side of me, the optimist side of the answer is that, you know, people can do this stuff if only they're given the opportunity to do it. Anyway, sorry, just a riff on that.
Yeah, so we should probably pretty soon switch to audience questions, but I guess one more question I have. So we've talked about, like, we use the term like going back, and I'm wondering, you know, like, well, for me, the framing is important, because when you say like going back traditional, like people kind of think, oh, we're going back to, like, you mentioned this, like peasant agriculture, maybe like feudal, you know, feudal system, and that doesn't seem, from especially from like a progressive point of view, it doesn't seem very attractive. And I mean, one way I like to frame it is, it's not so much going back, but we're bringing a lot of the things that worked in the past forward, right? But we're not necessarily getting rid of some of the, what, you know, again, from a kind of progressive point of view, some of the advancements we've seen in the 20th century, like civil rights, you know, most places, abolishment of slavery. And so I'm wondering, but also, you know, certain technologies, you know, and perhaps we have to account for you know, a much lower net energy future. So that has to be accounted for in technologies. But what do you see as kind of like different from, say, you know, in the small farm future, that would be different from the past, that might incorporate, you know, technologies, and might incorporate social, cultural, you know, progression, again, from a progressive point of view. Yeah, if you, and I know you've talked about, you talked a bit about this in the book, so I was wondering if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of reluctant to be too specific, because, you know, I guess you know, there's so much sort of technological futurism around that I kind of want to avoid that. But I think your overall premise, I agree with. It's, you know, part of the problem is this whole narrative of progress and the spatial metaphors, you know, the back and the forward, or, you know, lifting ourselves up or whatever. And, you know, the point, you know, the point is not to try and restore some notion of a superior past order. It's just to be open-minded about the situation that we find ourselves in, and, you know, we can learn from past models just as we can learn from present technologies and present models. You know, part of the problem is if we, you know, refuse, for example, a more labor-intensive or job-rich agriculture, just because we think, well, that's what people did in the past, so obviously we can't do that now because we've moved on from that. Well, you know, we haven't necessarily moved on, and you know, if you look at most parts of the world, you know, developed quite ecologically sound, low energy mixed agricultures that were, you know, pretty sort of satisfying balances of the ecological trade-offs that they faced. So I'm not saying that, you know, they all have to be replicated exactly, but, you know, it's a good place to start, to start looking at what a kind of low energy local agriculture in the future would be. But yeah, you know, a more challenging thing is your question about sort of moving on socially, and, you know, that's something I'm quite concerned about in the book. You know, at the sort of macro scale, you know, history's culture changes, you know, and I think we need to look at the sort of present modern moment, you know, not as some kind of end of history thing, but as, you know, but as another kind of culture historical moment which will pass. But certainly there are aspects, you know, that are important in terms of civil rights, kind of gender equality and so on. I mean, I don't necessarily think that a small farm future is inherently a patriarchal future, for example, but I do think those sorts of issues, you know, and I don't think it isn't going to be one either. You know, there isn't some kind of inherent progressive narrative towards, you know, towards more and more equality. So that is something I think, you know, needs to be addressed very carefully. I talk about it a bit in the book in terms of a public sphere. And again, that's where I try and make a virtue out of a crisis, in the sense of, you know, pre-existing identities are not going to be particularly relevant to creating a congenial local living in the future. We kind of we have to start with the people who are in place, and be mindful that everybody's voice counts. That nobody is kind of outside of the political community. So I mean, I think we have a lot of resources to kind of make that work locally, obviously there are countervailing forces, kind of nationalism, various kind of in and out groups, borders and boundaries, are already looming large in the world. So that, to me is a key battle to be fought, not to succumb to the nationalist narrative, which kind of is the, nationalism is the kind of spirituality of modernity that I think is essentially going to be a hindrance to the kind of small farm future, the congenial small farm future that we could have. But there are no simple answers. But the public sphere, I draw in the book on the traditions of civic republicanism. Joe Norman was talking in your last episode about kind of small town democracy kind of stuff. There are all of these political models. I like to joke that civic republican, agrarian, populist, left libertarianism is my shtick, which is the acronym is CRAPL, because CRAPL happened, but we need to we need to develop the best, draw from the best political traditions that we can to to ensure that when the crap happens, it's as positive as possible.
Thank you. Well, maybe we can transition now to bring in the audience, the guests. Peter, maybe I'll hand it off to you.
Cool. Thank you, Jason. So yeah, if you have any questions, start putting them in the chat. We won't get to everyone, and we have about 20 minutes to field some questions. So Kurt, you're up first, if you're still here. You can just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm here. Just wanted to ask about Kiss the Ground. Put the website in the chat. It seems like a strong community of farmers that are developing regenerative soil, and I wanted you to comment on that, please.
And I would just back up that question with even further. Are there ecological principles that necessarily follow from a small scale or not? Like, what is your sense of that? Because I think a lot of people, for example, where I live in Uruguay, there are a lot of people who do what someone might call regenerative practices, but maybe they're not calling it that. So again, like maybe you could tease out a little bit the labels, the scale, and regenerative agriculture on the small scale.
Right. I mean, yeah, I've sort of written a bit about regenerative agriculture. I seem to be the only person in the world who hasn't actually seen the Kiss the Ground film. But I think, there's a whole kind of suite of, a whole bunch of different things going on within, the umbrella of alternative agriculture, regen ag, organics. I mean, that's the whole thing, permaculture and so on. I do think that there is a danger that, I mean, I've been in meetings where people kind of say, well, with regen ag, we can absorb all the carbon emissions we're putting out into the soil, and we can carry on having big cities and, cheap air travel and so on. And I mean, I find that unconvincing. And I think there's, again, it's this kind of modernist knee-jerk thing that there's this kind of silver bullet solution, that if we get the soil right, then solves all problems of human life. So I do think there's a need to sort of rein it in a bit and realize that there's always ecological and social trade-offs. But nevertheless, I think basically what people are trying to do in the regen ag movement, caring about soil, thinking much more carefully about the kind of cycles, inputs, outputs, soil life, all of these things are going to be a really critical part of the future. In terms of scale, I mean, scale itself isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily play into some of those things, but I think where we have gone pretty badly wrong with scale is that basically something like 3/4 of global cropland is devoted to 10 crops. Basically 6 of them are cereals, and most of the rest are grain, legumes, or oilseed crops. And these are crops. They're basically all annuals that can be grown sort of very easily with mechanized methods, and that can be processed and produce macronutrients. Where I think scale comes in is that and all of those crops. I mean, obviously, we don't grow all this wheat and soy and so on for nothing. It answers to biological needs in certain ways, but we've gone way too far. The pendulum has swung way too far that way. And what you get with scale partly is labor is or jobs are extremely productive of in small areas, extremely productive of human well-being, extremely high yielding, but also it pushes us towards a more mixed agriculture, or horticulture, I should say. Fruit and vegetables, we need to eat more because they're good for us, and we don't because they're much harder to mechanize and turn into global commodity crops. Trees fit very well into smallholder farming in a way that they don't with large-scale arable farming. So immediately, and then you can fit livestock around that as well, rather than having these kind of huge, god-awful sort of meat factories. So all of these things start integrating at a local level in a way that they don't at at that larger level. So you can take any one claim in the regen ag movement and as I have done, I suppose, and submit it to some critical scrutiny. But ultimately, I think that way of thinking, and that way of thinking expressed locally, as is a big part of where we need to go.
Right. Jim, you had a question.
I do. Thanks, Peter. Hi, Chris.
Hi.
Englishman over in Ontario here.
All right.
Nice to see you. Yeah, my question was really about, I wondered if you saw any synergies from the small farm futures idea with the kind of high medieval guild system and the idea of distributism, which had a renaissance in the 1920s, if I recall, through the writings of people like Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton, who talked about that idea. But that was only kind of available to us as a kind of, when we were all still embedded, the economy was embedded in society, and now it seems to be, I think Polanyi talks about this idea of disembedding of the economy from society. Because I'm quite interested in not just farming, and I know you are, the trades that are associated with farming, the blacksmiths, the carpenters, the barrel makers, all these people that are interrelated into the farming community. And if we got all those back, there would be jobs in the landscape, So yeah, just wondered if you could speak to that. Be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, distributism is interesting, and since I wrote the book, there's this whole bunch of sort of distributists have suddenly, I've suddenly become aware of them, and they've started following me on Twitter and so on. If that's not an irony, I don't know. So yeah, I mean, I've read a bit of Belloc and Chesterton, and there's aspects of it that are, sort of slightly great on, but I think basically what they were arguing is absolutely right, and that's where I think what the sort of things I'm saying connect with a certain type of conservatism, which is always sort of odd that it's been conservatism associated with sort of capitalism and the market, because the sort of basic small town conservatism of essentially a moral economy is what this is about. It's about the fact that pursuing profit as an entrepreneur is not ultimately what it's all about. It's about being part of a functional economy that gives service to people, and that service includes, you know, certainly all the things that we need as farmers, the sort of blacksmith goods and so on, but also creating jobs. And yeah, it's kind of funny because it's not that, although you're right, you know, things have become disembedded. I mean, you know, it's kind of funny that it's not that long ago, you know, it's, you know, even in, I would guess in the US and, you know, here in Western Europe, that, you know, the sort of farm kit that you can buy that was new 50 years ago is almost sort of homestead scale compared to what you see now. And, you know, there's, you know, blacksmiths in the 1950s were kind of fixing up people's, you know, domestic appliances and so on in, you know, in a way. Yeah, so it's kind of within living memory, a lot of this stuff. Doesn't mean it's easy to sort of bring it back, but it's not, you know, it's not completely gone. But I think that notion of a moral economy is increasingly taking hold as, you know, as we're sort of more and more Amazonized and Googleized, you know, there's an inevitable pushback. So I think, yeah, and particularly because of the failure of some of the sort of large scale leftist movements, I think that draws us back into, you know, reappraising movements like distributism that kind of fell by the wayside because of large scale organized industrial labor, which sort of now no longer seems to me to be the route out of this. So yeah, it's absolutely time to be talking about distributism again.
That's fantastic, thank you. And I think there is an element to distributism which also has, and that whole movement which has an underlying faith. You know, there's a spirituality. Right.
Yeah,
I mean, with distributism, it was Christianity. That's, you know, and yeah. But it could be something else, couldn't it? But anyway, yeah. Thank you.
I mean, we haven't talked too much about that, but I do think, yeah, faith and spirituality is important, and also commons. You know, guilds and commons are very, you know, very interactive. But you know, again, I talk about it quite a bit in the book. You know, people sometimes have a slightly naive view as to the way that commons work, and you know, they have to be grounded within communities locally, not, you know, it's not some kind of airy general view about everybody working together. It's about, you know, how do we solve this problem here where we are, you know, and I think that's quite important.
Brilliant, thank you.
Briefly, Peter, before we ask the next question, just because it's come up a couple of times, I'm wondering, Chris, if you could talk a little bit about your view about how spirituality might play into the transformation we're seeking. We talked a little bit about it with Joe Norman last time, and I was saying even something so simple as caring for your children and your land and your animals is the spiritual act. When you're sort of forced into it, interdependence, you know, being relied upon and relying upon others in my community feels spiritual to me. But maybe you could speak a little more about your thoughts about that topic.
Yeah, I can, although they're not all that well formulated. I mean, I listened to your session with Joe and I agreed with, you know, what he was saying and your response to that. I mean, my background is very kind of atheistic and secular, but very much as Joe was saying last time, you know, the experience, you know, partly thinking about the politics and the community side of it, but also interacting on the land, you know, has drawn me into a more spiritual frame of reference. But I haven't quite figured out, you know, what that is. But I do think, you know, I said earlier, I mean, humans are inherently spiritual, and that's partly why I think, you know, I think, and in fact, Jason mentioned very interestingly last time about death and the importance of death, because that kind of seems to me what eco-modernism is about. Like most, you know, throughout most of human history, our time on Earth is thought to be just a short journey of the soul that's part of a much bigger journey. We're now in this situation where, for a lot of people, including me, you kind of think, when I'm dead, that's it, I'm dust, you know, and that's a pretty hard thing to reckon with. And I think so much of our notions about progress are bound up with that. It's like, okay, so I might die, but I'm part of this culture that's going on to great things. It's going to colonize Mars and all of this. And, you know, ultimately the technology and all of that kind of sci-fi stuff isn't what that's about. It's about personal, you know, it's about dealing with one's own personal, you know, fate. But I think that's where, you you know, longer term, I think all sorts of interesting things are going to happen around that. And, you know, if we look at, perhaps I shouldn't get drawn into my thing about galactic polities, but I think it's, you know, there's a very interesting sort of dialectic between very materialist ways of thinking that then kind of getting expressed in kind of extreme forms of spirituality that can be quite pathological, you know, nationalism being one of them. And I think, again, in terms of your earlier question about models from the past, there are models of spiritual practice, which maybe is going back to relates to Jim's question, that I think are very informative for where we have to go in terms of being, you know, producing our livelihoods, being part of community, being part of something larger than ourselves, and a sort of notion of you know, the soul and, you know, the sort of directedness of life. So so I think all of this is spiritual, including, you know, the most kind of anti-spiritual people, I think, ultimately are kind of making a spiritual claim. And, you know, and this is something I want to sort of, I did have a chapter in my book where I played around with some of those ideas. And, you know, again, in terms of things like people saying, oh, you know, you'll never sort of break consumerism. You know, people just want to consume. But again, it's a kind of spiritual thing. And there's other aspects of life where, you know, we emphasize asceticism in certain aspects of life, like working hard, you know, being a hard-working family and so on. So, you know, all of these things ultimately, I think, are larger spiritual and cultural claims. And we try and, because we live in this very sort of secular materialistic culture, we try and dress them up as not being that, but they are. And so I think this is going to, you know, there's going to be sort of really big trajectories of change around that in the future. And I hope to, you know, to sort of think and write more about that in the future myself.
I'm wondering, Jason, if you have thought any more about your doomer optimism as Christianity metaphor, or any other, you know, meditation, you know, connection to nature, spirituality.
Not really, and not necessarily as Christianity, but I think you know, I think the analogy, the core analogy, or the core claim in Christianity is very similar to doomer optimism. You know, coming to terms with death, and then, or I like the analogy of the seed that St. Paul uses of, you know, the seed has to be cracked open for the tree to grow out of it. And so that's a very spiritual metaphor, and, you know, doomer optimism could map onto that, I think. But
I've got to tell you guys that I spoke to my son earlier on the phone and told him I was doing this. And when I said doomer optimism, he heard me as saying boomer optimism, and he said there's way too much of that around already. So that's one to be careful of, I think.
Yeah, exactly. But somebody did on Twitter say okay doomer, so, you know, there's a lot of overlap there. Okay, so I just wanted to sort of highlight that the next session we'll be inviting Chris back, and we will be inviting Dr. Vandana Shiva to come to the STOA. And I'm wondering if highlighting in advance and speaking to another person's question here, you know, Chris, what do you want people to take away from this session? I'm wondering if we can start to highlight almost a vision or a movement. You know, what are we advocating for when we have Vandana on, who's also an advocate for a small farm agroecology type future? You know, what are we aiming for here? What are their guiding principles? You know, can we collaborate internationally? You know, how can we accelerate this movement and support one another?
Is that a question to me, or?
Yes, that's a question to you. And also maybe, I guess, sort of previewing some of your ideas, even if they're not fully baked, for the upcoming session.
I mean, I suppose one thing that's on my mind is the whole question of trade. I mean, it'll be fascinating talking to her. I appreciate you guys setting that up, and particularly as a British man talking to an Indian woman, because you know, there's this sort of whole history of the sort of globalization of food commodity flows, that British colonialism in India was, you know, the kind of one of the paramount examples. And, you know, we've got into this narrative now where trade is inherently good. But, you know, I think in this forum, I imagine, it, you know, people will be comfortable with the idea that it isn't, you know, that you actually need to create, you know, livelihoods locally, which kind of in some ways means, you know, actively, you know, turning away from those possibilities. And that's quite a hard argument to sort of have in terms of all the economics of protectionism and so on. I mean, there's a movement of so-called progressive protectionism. So I think, you know, it'd be interesting to talk to her about that. And obviously she's written, you know, all the sort of stuff she's written about, you know, seed sovereignty and so on is, you know, directly feeds into that, where, you know, we need to, you know, rather than just having a sort of beggar my neighbor protectionism where you know, you try and stop other people's goods coming in and foist all your stuff on the rest of the world, you know, the collaboration, I think, has to be a kind of mutual recognition of local development, and obviously how that plays out will depend on all sorts of political and technological factors. But you know, I think that sort of issue about you know, agreeing on boundaries will be interesting. But I don't know, I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts on that.
Jason, do you have anything to add?
Not right now.
No, and one thing I just want to add to hype up the next session, Vandana Shiva is just really one of the preeminent speakers on this topic, and has quite a lot of clout in many different types of circles. Yet it seems like the environmentalist movement is sort of, you know, there's these factions, as we talked about at the beginning. So I am just absolutely thrilled to facilitate a meeting of the minds, you know, sort of global north, global south, agroecological, small scale, peasant livelihoods versus, you know, can we call them peasants in the global north? This kind of conversation. One thing that I noticed in my dissertation research is that what people were doing in Chicago is so similar to what people are doing in Uruguay. I mean, it's just chickens, garden, you know, fruit trees. And I think there's this sense like we're so different from one another when in fact, I think we're quite similar. And there's a lot of overlap and a lot of potential for collaboration. So I'm excited about that session.
Yeah. And, you know, again, there's a whole, you know, there's a very sort of top-down notion of development. I mean, I think the concept of development is an interesting one, you know, sort of biologically and socially. But I was talking about this in another webinar where, you know, there's almost like this one single sort of now neoliberal model that, you know, this is how a country develops. And it's basically a, you know, a sort of simulation of the Western path of development, whereas really, and it's almost, you know, I mean, I think a sort of virus metaphor really is quite appropriate to capitalism, is that, you know, you can only, you know, the only way it kind of spreads itself in you know, into different body politics and kind of forces people to reproduce its, you know, profit creating logic. What we really need is, you know, people, you know, development is a good thing, you know, humans are intrinsically, you know, in terms of, again, the doomer optimism sort of label, humans are intrinsically looking to improve things and looking on the bright side and, hey, let's try this new idea. But, you know, ideas can be different and appropriate in different places. And we need to get beyond this kind of singular notion that, you know, this is what the good life is about. This is what development is. And, you know, foster the conditions for people to determine, you know, development for themselves, which has sort of been a, you know, very much a part of what she's written about, and will be interesting. And also interesting in the history of Indian colonialism, you know, because that sort of Gandhian vision of you know, local village autonomy and sort of producing for self was so important, you know, in that anti-colonial history. So, yeah, I'm hoping we might be able to talk about that a little bit.
Well, Peter. Are we out of time?
We're at the top of the hour. If you want to go on a little bit longer.
Yes, one more. Can we bring in one more person for a question? If everybody's on board.
Sure. Catherine, you had a question or thought earlier.
Yes, and then I disappeared to give my local friend some cucumber seedlings. We were talking about deurbanization, and there have been various examples through history. I haven't checked how Detroit is doing recently, but I know that there was around a decade or maybe a decade and a half ago, because of housing problems and the collapse of the car industry, there was a lot of very empty, very cheap property there. And I know there were a lot of projects to start little gardens. And so that might be an interesting thing to see. I think it's worth bearing in mind that change won't arrive everywhere at the same time. And so there will be early examples. And I wonder if you think that some of what happened in Detroit might be one early example of what could happen elsewhere, and whether we could learn from that much more recent history.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of the Detroit example. I mean, I don't know too much about it in detail, but certainly I've, come across that sort of idea of kind of deindustrializing and depopulating urban core, and that opening up possibilities. And I mean, I think that's, that's basically right. We could, I guess my vision isn't necessarily a kind of pastoral vision where everyone has to be living in splendid isolation from everyone else. It's basically just about, meeting needs locally in a sort of low energy, low capital future. So as, most likely as a city like Detroit deurbanizes, there's no longer such a reason for everybody to want to move to Detroit. So that opens up the possibility for people who are living in Detroit to then start using the space differently. I mean, you get this whole kind of eco-modernist vertical farming kind of thing, which is a little bit of a different point, which I think is quite problematic. But yeah, the idea that that we can deconcentrate and that then creates more urban possibilities, I think is absolutely spot on. And yeah, all of those models, kind of garden cities, a bit more planned than Detroit, but yeah, there's I don't think there's necessarily a sort of a particular geography of settlement that is going to be right everywhere. I do think that we, cities have emerged from essentially mining energetic stocks, and the longer term future for humanity is going to be sort of skimming ecological flows. So that does point to a much more distributed population, but that doesn't mean that obviously cities emerge in various places to concentrate people and resources in various ways, and in this kind of moment of deconcentration and deurbanization, that opens plenty of opportunities in cities for sure.
I would just make one last comment and then we can wrap it up. Yes, my dissertation research was talking to people who did subsistence food production in Chicago, and exactly the same type of setup. There's just, one of the people I interviewed just commandeered an empty lot that was a former paint factory that had moved out of town, and they brought in boats people were throwing away and filled them with soil. They got wood chips of Christmas trees that the city wood chips all the Christmas trees, and they want to just throw the wood chips out. They'll give them to anyone who will take them. They took the wood chips, they inoculated them with mushrooms to try to get all the toxins out. This kind of stuff, I almost feel like I read something somewhere once where a civilization living amongst our own ruins. I think there is some sense of that. There are places in which we are, look to the ruins, look to the edges, where things have hollowed out, and see what experimentation is happening. I'm extremely optimistic after having done that research with those people who are incredibly innovative and capable and producing quite a bit. So.
Right, and again, it illustrates that point of people just being creative at sort of problem solving at a local practical level, and that's how we need to develop these new commons, which will certainly and again, issues of places that were marginal will, that whole kind of center periphery structuring is going to kind of spin on its is going to be reconfigured in all sorts of ways, but that kind of basic human problem solving and imagining thing is that's where the optimism lies for me too. Yeah, I completely agree.
Well, all right, thank you everybody. I want to thank you, Chris. I thought this was wonderful, and I just want to encourage, if you liked what he had to say, his book is excellent. I really enjoyed his book, so Small Farm Future. I would encourage you to check that out. And I also want to encourage you to attend our session with Vandana Shiva. That'll be July 8th at 10 a.m. Eastern, and you can register at the STOA website. We'll also be announcing it on social media, and Chris will be leading the conversation with her. And so I'm really excited about that. I expect to learn a lot and enrich my perspective a lot. So I hope you will join us. And thank you, Peter, for providing this platform for us. It's a great service you're providing, not only to us but to many different people. So thank you, Peter, and thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.